Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we have yet another email from Natalie. Natalie, you know who you are. We don't know who you are, but you know who you are, especially after I read your email. For those of you new to the channel, what I do in these series of videos that I call Ask Yoel is pretty much literally sit in front of the camera, read emails I receive from CFIs, student pilots, rated pilots, whoever and wherever they might be, and whatever topic they might be talking about. And I read the email and then I talk about it. So some emails will be questions. Other emails will be they're looking for my opinion, or they want me to clarify something. So if you're new here, welcome. As always, the one thing I ask is, because we're looking to spread the word, we're looking to share this information with as many people out there, student pilots or whoever else might benefit from this information. The way YouTube does it is if you subscribe, like, comment, the more you, the viewer, engage with these videos, the more YouTube or the algorithm goes, oh, there's something going on there. And then they kind of spread the information because YouTube, the algorithm figures, the more action happens with a video, the more people might want to kind of be a part of it and watch it and be exposed to it. So that's how YouTube works. So if you're new here, welcome. I'll jump into Natalie's email, but that's what I ask. I ask that the more engagement, the subscribe, like, whatever it is you feel comfortable in doing, the more this information will be pushed and sent and presented to other people out there who need this, just like you. So here we go. Let's jump right into Natalie's email. It's a good email. The reason I picked this one today is I think it's a topic that many could relate with, because we pretty much think about this or should be thinking or aware of this concept every time we go fly. So here it goes. Hi, Yoel. Big fan of your videos. Thank you, Natalie. They always teach me a lot. I recently watched a video where you were talking with your student about how we only execute in the air and plan on the ground. Yes, I recently had a video put up where I was talking with my student. I think we were doing navlogs, and we were talking about how when it comes to flying an airplane, all the execution and planning and thinking and drawing and calculating happens on the ground, and in the air, it's literally just execution. We're just executing the plan. So yes, how we only execute in the air and plan on the ground. While I think I understand what you mean, I wanted to reach out and see if you'd be willing to discuss this topic further on one of your upcoming videos. Thanks for all you do, Natalie. Natalie, thanks for your email. Excellent question. Glad to have you here on the channel. Did you specify what you're doing? Like, are you, let's see. They always teach me a lot. Recently, you do not. So I don't know if you're a private pilot, a student pilot, but either way, or maybe you're an instructor, whatever it might be. Either way, this is an excellent topic, so I'm glad you emailed it in. And I'm very, very happy, more than happy, to discuss this topic, because it's something I find many pilots, it's interesting. It's one of those things in flying where once you get it and you wrap your head around it, then you get it, and then you're flying. Things become a lot clearer. But unless someone tells you these words and talks about this, it's something that I find makes a big difference when people become aware of this phenomena. So what Natalie is referring to is this thing I often talk about, which is when it comes to flying an airplane, there's two phases, okay? Or another way of saying that is we could break down every single flight into two phases. Phase number one happens on the ground before the plane becomes airborne. It happens in your house before you even leave to the airport. It happens in your hangar. It happens in the FBO. It happens on the ground. So phase one is on the ground. Phase two of every flight happens in flight, in the air. What should be happening in phase number one, ideally in a perfect world, should not be happening in phase number 2. And what I mean by that is this. In phase number 1, on the ground before the flight takes place, what we should be doing is planning, calculating, researching, looking at weather, calling the briefer, figuring out the route, deciding what altitude we'll cruise at. All these planning stuff, this planning bucket, should all be on the ground. In the air, once we leave the ground and take off, literally all we want to do, and I'll talk about the imperfect world we live in a moment, but let's assume this world is perfect for a moment. All we want to do in the air once we take off is literally execute and put to work the planning that we spent whatever amount of time leading up to that flight. Planning and researching and calculating and looking up and figuring out a route and researching our route and checking the terrain, whatever it might be. Okay. That said, that is a perfect world. Okay. And then once we take off, we literally want to be stupid monkeys. We want to execute the plan. So if the plan was a right downwind departure and then direct to blah, 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 and climb to an XYZ altitude, we want to do that. Okay. That's kind of the idea. Now that's a perfect world. You might be sitting there going, well, the world's not perfect, which you'd be right. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't kind of try and understand this concept and implement it into every one of our flight and adjust where we need to. So what I always tell my students is planning should happen on the ground. Execution should happen in the air. Sometimes, specifically, I could think of a time when you might need to divert, right? Maybe an unexpected diversion comes up or something unexpected. You show up to your destination airport and maybe a plane landed with the landing gear up on the runway or whatever, flat tire on the runway. There's a plane on the runway. The runway's closed. The only runway at your airport is closed, right? We need to do some planning, and we need to do some research, and we need to do some looking information up and gathering information and coming up with a new plan in the moment, in the plane. We don't have a choice. We're not on the ground. So this is the real world we live in. True. But most flights, okay, the vast majority of flights you will conduct in training, out of training, whatever it might be, 99.9% of them, even though we don't live in a perfect world, will be executed or are able to be executed and flown and completed to a very close degree. It could resemble very closely the planning that you've done on the ground. 99% of your flights. We'll get to the 1% where you might need to, like we said a moment ago, your runway is closed, and now we need to come up with a new plan. 99% of your flights, you can go ahead and plan them on the ground and execute them exactly the way you did in the air. Give or take, very, very closely, okay? So, Natalie, I think what you're looking for here is sort of just a little further breakdown and explanation of what I mean. So let's take something that you are familiar with, and that is the GPS on your phone or your car. And let's assume that you're going to drive someplace. I don't know where you live, but I will assume that just like me, you're a big fan of Costco. So you get into your car and you plug in Costco and you select the Costco you want to go to, and you start driving. You're following your GPS to Costco. So let me ask you this. How much time before you start moving with your car, before your car starts moving, how much time, how many minutes do you spend sitting there and researching your route and planning the route and looking over your route and figuring out what the terrain and the buildings along the way and frequencies and what type of exit you'll make out of the parking lot and what type of entrance you'll make into the Costco parking lot? How long, how many minutes, what period of time do you spend sitting there before your wheels start moving, planning and researching and gathering information about your route. And only then, when you feel good, and by the way, not to mention checking the weather along your route to Costco, right? And only then start driving to Costco. Well, it's almost funny when I say it this way, because what we do in a car, what I do in a car, and what probably most people do in a car, even when it comes to a 4-hour route, let's say you're driving from LA to Vegas, right? What most people do is they plug in their destination, the GPS populates a little thing, and then you just start driving and following the prompts. And we trust that our GPS will get us to where we need to get to on roads that can handle our car and won't take us off to wherever. Excellent. There's no problem with that. You're in a car, that's how we do it. Great. Now, think of showing up into the world of flying and aviation and airplanes, bringing that same programming in your brain along with you into this world where now plugging in a flight, a destination, and just having the GPS draw a nice straight line to your destination and just taking off and flying like you do in your car. Imagine how far that will get you with airspace and mountains and weather and all these different things that could and will be factors. Depending on where you live, they might be more or less of a factor, but there's terrain everywhere in most places. There's airspace in most places. Not middle America, but if you live in any big city, airspace is a giant factor. And weather, right? If I plug in Vegas into my GPS and it just says I'll be there in 4 hours, I just start driving. There could be fog on the way, right? But I don't call the weather briefer before I start driving and look to see if there's going to be any adverse weather. Now, if there's like crazy storms and whatever, and I heard that there's flooding happening and roads are closed, I might postpone my, go at a later time. But unlike planes, I won't be doing all this research before my car starts moving. But in a plane, we need to do a lot of research. And the reason we need to do a lot of research is twofold, 2 reasons. The first reason we need to do research before our wheels leave the ground in a plane is because, like I said a moment ago, when it comes to flying, there's so many things that now become factors and issues if we don't think about them and take them into account, such as airspace. What's the airspace looking like in my area? Okay, so if you're flying IFR, you took care of that one because now there's like no airspace. But there's weather. There's what altitude am I going to cruise at, right? What am I going to file at? All these different things. And with VFR, there's a lot more problems on your plate. So there's a lot of planning that goes into a flight. And there's a lot of time we spend thinking about the execution of a given flight from point A to point B. And it's a lot more time and detail that is devoted to planning a route in your plane than you otherwise would in your car. Which is why, as an instructor who's aware of the students I teach, the people I teach are people like you and I who drive cars, use our GPS to get to Costco and Vegas. And when for some of my students are in their 50s, 60s. So think of a brain that for 60 years, well, GPS wasn't out for 60 years, but think of a brain that for many years was programmed to plug in a destination and start driving. Plug in a destination and go. And all of a sudden we put them in a plane and we tell them, let's plan on a destination and don't yet go. Hang tight. There's a lot of stuff to look at. So that kind of transition with your brain takes a little time. So if you find yourself, Natalie, I don't know much about you. I just have this email that you sent me. But if you find yourself, again, there could be a million reasons why you want to hear more of this topic. Maybe this is something you struggle with. Maybe this is something you should, maybe in your flights, you should spend more time on the ground in the planning and research phase as opposed to maybe doing it later on in the flight, which, by the way, many people do. Many people, you'd be amazed. People who are unaware of this they never had this talk. They never heard this and went, oh yeah, that's interesting. We don't go about executing a flight like we do executing a trip in our car, right? And until they hear these words, they don't put the 1+1 together, and they struggle because they treat the plane like the car. And what ends up happening is they start doing research on the airport they're going to. Oh, what's my TPA at this airport? While they join downwind. Not so great, right? Because that's kind of a phase of a flight that you wish to not come in contact with another plane. So you kind of want to know where people are at. So there's all these different things that should have happened before we left the ground, and then sadly ends up happening in flight, and it's not so great because sometimes it could even compromise safety, right? Or it could compromise situational awareness, let alone safety. So there's a lot of issues that we could avoid if we just kind of spent that time on the ground planning. But again, if you wrote me this email because you find yourself being one of these pilots who maybe instead of doing the extent of the research and planning and calculating on the ground, you kind of bring it into the airplane with you, then I'm glad you emailed me and I'm glad we're talking about it. Because what I want you to understand is, right now talking about this, I'm just reminded of words I told my students once in a plane. It's probably in one of the videos on the channel. And that is this. There's a saying I once heard from, I think it was Jim Rohn. I don't want to take credit for this, but it's a saying. I was listening to someone who's a great speaker, and they said, this is amazing. I love that I just remembered this because we're talking about this topic. I think this will help you. The time we start building the building, okay, is once the building is complete. Let me say that again. The time we start building the building or the house or whatever structure it is you're building, the time we start building it is once it is complete. Now, what does this mean? It means the following. If we want to build a house, do we just show up and start building? Or do we first spend a good amount of time planning, measuring, drawing, right? Speak with any architect. Their office is filled with big papers of drawings. So when do you start building the building? Once the building is complete, meaning once all the planning and drawing and calculations are complete, that's when we lay the first brick. We do the same thing as pilots. When do we go fly? When do we start the flight? When do we begin the flight? Once the flight is complete. I'll say it again. When do we take off in our plane? Once the flight is complete. It sounds weird, but what it means is this. We only depart and take off and set out on executing this flight only once the planning, the research, the information, the knowledge we need to have has all been taken care of on the ground. So when do we build the building? Once the building is complete. When do we start flying? When do we go fly? Once the flight has been completed in terms of planning and research and gathering all the information you need. And I'm awesomely and amazingly happy that I was reminded in my brain of this saying because I think it fits so beautifully with what we're talking about. And it drives home the importance of planning and calculating and figuring things out on the ground before you ever get into your airplane, let alone taxi and let alone taking off. Okay? So the reason I brought up the whole car example with GPS is because unlike building a building, thankfully, technology's come a long way. It's convenient. We use our GPS. We drive all day long. Boom, plug it in. We drive. But the cool thing about a car, unlike a plane, is we're always going to stay on the ground, on the Earth's surface. We're not going to levitate, so terrain's not an issue. So there's many things that become less of an issue. We could pull over if something happens. Where in a plane, we have a lot more to think about. But nonetheless, don't underestimate this. Your brain for many, many, many years, Natalie, has been programmed to plug in a destination and start driving. Plug in a destination and start driving. And here you show up to the world of flying and we plug in a destination, at least mentally. We come up with a plan. We say we want to fly to X, and we don't start driving. We start planning. We start researching. We start gathering information. We start, and if you're a student pilot doing navlogs, we start plotting, and we start figuring out altitudes, and we start looking at possible routes, and we start looking at airspace. And so your brain is not used to all this. Your brain's like, well, what the heck are you doing? I thought we know where we're going. Why are we not going, right? Like you do in your car. And you got to reprogram that brain. You got to tell your brain, slow down. The fact that we know what where our destination's at doesn't mean we need to rush and head out and go right now. There's planning, there's research. We want to wrap our head around stuff. So when do we start building the building, Natalie? Only once the building is complete. When do we take off in an airplane? Only once the flight is complete. Okay, and now after I explained it, you understand exactly what that means. So always remember this. When do we take off? Once the flight's been completed. When do we build a building? Once the building is complete. Remember, this is good for life too, not just aviation and not just building buildings. This is good for life in many, many different areas. But it's extremely important when it comes to flying an airplane. I do my planning, my research, everything before I take off. And then I go and I execute my plan. I literally make my plan come alive. And like I said before, sometimes the world we live in is less perfect than other times. And things might come up in flight unexpectedly, no heads up, where we have no choice but to bring all that planning and research and calculating into the cockpit. We don't have a choice. We have to. Okay? Something unexpectedly shows up in or outside of your airplane, which causes you to maybe need to divert. Maybe something came up with your engine. Maybe something came up with systems on the plane. You can't plan and anticipate every single situation that will come up. So part of training is not only just taking everything I just said and said, okay, I'm no longer thinking and using my brain in the plane. That's not what I'm saying. Part of training, part of being a good, safe pilot is understanding that 99% of your flights, thankfully, you'll be able to do all the thinking on the ground and the planning and the gathering information and then the execution in the air. 99% of your flights, you will be able to do that, and that's excellent. But we also need to prepare for that 1%. That 1% where we just need to start figuring stuff out in the air on the go. So remember, there's a balance between the two. There's a balance between the two, and it's an understanding of how would my planning differ on the ground from the air, right? So we now need to be aware of, whoa, I'm now in this machine that's doing about 100, 150 miles over the ground. If I don't have autopilot, it might be even more workload on my end, because if you have an autopilot, you could just have the plane maintain its own positive control over itself as you gather information. So it's just a good understanding of that the planning in the plane might be a little different than the planning at your kitchen table at home when everything is calm. But nonetheless, sometimes the world we live in is not perfect, and we'll have to kind of go about things in the way that we have to go about things, and we don't have a choice. But I'm speaking to the 99, that might be a video for another time. I'm speaking right now to the 99% of flights you will ever conduct. Plan on the ground, execute in the air. And you'll find the more you understand this, the more, by the way, which is another video coming up, because I received countless emails about staying ahead of the airplane, the topic of staying ahead of the airplane. People want to know, how could I stay more ahead of the airplane? I'll make a video on that coming up here soon. But one thing I'll say to that right now is the more you understand this concept of planning on the ground, executing in the air, the more you come to terms with it, the more you embrace it, the more you become the pilot who says, okay, that's my destination. But wait, I have a lot of stuff to start looking at before I get into my plane. The more you become that kind of pilot, I'll give you a little secret right now, the more ahead of the plane you will find yourself being in the air. And one of the biggest reasons as to why that is because now when you're in the plane, you're just busy executing. You're not busy researching and looking things up and planning and thinking. All you're doing is sitting there, executing, bringing your plan to life. You're literally matching what you're doing to your plan. So your workload, in essence, is unbelievably reduced. And that alone allows you to stay ahead of the plane for a whole slew of other reasons, but this is one of the biggest ones. You're just executing. You're just sitting there executing your plan. You're not busy doing a bunch of other stuff, which, by the way, causes people to fall behind the airplane. So, Natalie, excellent question. I hope this little chit-chat about planning and executing. When do we start building the building? Only once the building is complete. Always remember that. I think that sentence is excellent, and it really drives home. It really brings home specifically what we're talking about here. When do we go fly? Only once the flight is complete. I hope this was helpful, Natalie, and I want to hear from you in another email if this actually made a difference for you in your planning and in your execution of flights, even if it's a short flight, right? Gather the frequencies, figure out the traffic pattern direction, figure out the traffic pattern altitude, look at the airspace. You might not be dealing with thunderstorms on a short flight, but there's a lot of stuff to get ahead of the plane and think about that are associated with every single flight you'll ever take. All right, you guys, until next time, I hope this was helpful. Take care, fly safe, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Hey guys, it's Yoel. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it answered some of your questions, confusion, whatever it might be, that I was able to help you in your own flight training journey. If you did enjoy the video and you did find it helpful, I would appreciate if you would subscribe to the channel and like the video. What that does with the YouTube algorithm is it kind of lets the AI way of letting YouTube know that there's some interest here and there's some helpful information for others, and that way YouTube will share this with other students or people who are going through flight training just like you. So if you do those things, it always helps, and I do appreciate it. Secondly, if you also have a topic, a question, a topic, a concern, confusion, whatever it might be that you want me to talk about on these videos here, go ahead and email me. There's an email in the description of this video below. So if you click on the description of the video, you'll see an email. Email that email with your question or topic, whatever it is you want me to talk about. And in the subject line of the email, write Ask Yoel, because this series is what I call Ask Yoel. So that way when the emails come in, we're able to separate them and know that your email is a topic you want me to discuss on these videos. Anyhow, hope it was helpful, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Take care.